Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, something that comes up a lot when we're talking about Israel-Palestine is the Western role. And I know that that's a very, very broad statement to be making in a very broadly defined phrase, probably for many people who would have different interpretations of it. But I mean, within this program, we're going to try to broach that topic, nevertheless, in the context of what's currently happening across the occupied territory. So we're talking about things like arms sales, military aid as well. We've just had, or we will have, I believe, very soon, precision-guided missiles, which will be sold to Israel. I believe the amount is around $735 million, if I'm not mistaken. On top of that, we do have some Democrats who are now looking into possibly tying military aid to Israel with human rights on the ground. And overall, then there's also then the question at the United Nations, for example, of the U.S., as well as other allied countries to Israel, providing quote-unquote political cover to it. And I know that that's something that's also debated quite often. But for example, we've had the U.S. veto a number of resolutions that have come to the United Nations Security Council, more specifically, regarding ceasefires, et cetera, especially in the context, as I said, of what's currently happening in Gaza, as well as the West Bank, et cetera. Let's discuss all of those points a bit further. And I join with Dr. David Mednicoff, who is the chair of the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies. He's also an associate professor of Middle Eastern Studies. This is all University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's joining us this morning from Amherst, Massachusetts. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Khalil Jahshan, who is the executive director of the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. And joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is Dr. Lustick, who is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the author of Paradigm Lost: From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. Ayan, Khalil, and David, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for taking your time out to join us today. David, I'd like to start with you. I know that I made quite a broad statement about a Western role when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine, but overall, do you think that there is a shift occurring ever so slowly, possibly, which would mean that the West would be possibly more balanced, if I may use that term as well, when it comes to what happens on the ground there?
I think that we're absolutely beginning to see a shift. Indeed, we could talk about a shift going on in much of Western Europe for quite a few decades now. There's been a significant pro-Palestinian movement in many Western countries. And of course, it's really been in the United States where we've seen more of a lag or more of a disconnect between a sort of small but growing pro-Palestinian activist population and the much greater tendency for the government, at least, to support Israel, not unconditionally, but certainly very strongly, and even when it goes against what other Western allies do. But what we're seeing now is a combination of a demographic shift among younger Jewish Americans, with less identification with the Israeli state, coupled with lots of activism on the pro-Palestinian side, and more progressive Democrats also coming into Congress. And this is not coming in an isolation. Really, it's a result of the way that the Israeli government itself has shifted to the right, and ultra-nationalist Israelis have become more and more important in Israel.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that David there made, didn't he, about American Jews, right? And that's also a huge aspect, possibly, in the shift that may occur?
Absolutely, he's right. But you can think of it this way. Israel has gone from being a blue state, like Massachusetts or Connecticut, to a purple state, to a deeply red state. It's like Oklahoma or Idaho. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party has absorbed deeply blue parts of the country, generationally and ideologically, ethnically. But what's really interesting about the current juncture, which in 50 years of following things, I've never seen this, is that when you're dealing with a non-vital issue in foreign policy, the domestic political implications of your decisions always trump the foreign policy considerations. When dealing with Israel in these wars in the past, the president has never confronted a situation where his political interests are being, his domestic political interests are being threatened because of the suffering of Palestinians. It's always been because of the fears of Israelis. This is the first time that the bigger fish to fry that the president always has, the massive priorities that he has, are endangered because of a split in his party over the Palestinian issue. And this means that we are entering somewhat uncharted territory from a political and diplomatic point of view, adding to the fact that this is the first time in a long time when a war will end between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and without there being some kind of even pretense that you could enter two-state solution negotiations. And that means that diplomats in America have to do some quick learning about how to approach this problem now as a problem of inequality rather than diplomacy specifically.
And Khalil, I wonder what your thoughts are on how Biden has reacted to all this, right? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, it took him a while, didn't it, to directly get involved, in the sense that, even when he became president, he didn't immediately address the issue of Israel-Palestine anyhow, which I would think other presidents have done in the past too, not prioritizing it necessarily. But even in this latest bout of violence, he hasn't really been very explicitly involved either. Why do you think that is? And do you think that the shift, for example, him talking directly to Rashida Tlaib, for example, when he went to Michigan, that is a significant shift even for somebody like Biden, who has been extremely supportive, of course, of Israel in the past?
Definitely. I think the reaction of President Biden from day one of this crisis has been weak and timid, too slow. And he apparently was so surprised, first of all, by the events, like everybody else in a way, but he's the president of the United States. He needs to adjust and move quickly. Number two, he doesn't seem to estimate the danger involved in this passive approach. Even though he keeps privately promising future better ideas for Palestine, more involvement on his part and the part of his administration. But he fails to realize that what he's doing right now is making that virtually impossible, is making it very, very difficult for him to pursue that. So he seems to be adjusting belatedly. He did alter some of his views with regards to the ceasefire, but the changes were too little, too late. In a way, the damage is done, and he continues to face a serious challenge. Whether he is influenced by the people he's meeting, I think he does. Knowing Biden personally, I would say, first of all, he's very emotional. He is torn apart on this issue. He has never been known for his clarity on this issue. He keeps wavering. He is torn between his personal emotional commitment to Zionism and to Israel, and the fact that he belongs to somewhat of a progressive party and movement that is changing by the minute. And he hasn't been able to reconcile those two. It's a personal tug of war, if you will, internally within Biden, and he doesn't seem to be adjusting well to that.
Yeah. David, as you well know, there's a call to tie military aid to Israel with human rights. And even, I believe, Senator Sanders has called for that entire aid, in fact, to be studied properly, if it is even to go ahead. And of course, there's a whole host of other issues that are being brought up by the likes of Rashida Tlaib, AOC, and others. Is that too far a step right now? I mean, do you think that it's too early for that to happen, or are we at that point now?
I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but I do think that the ball is rolling a little more quickly than people thought. I think that Ian's point that the very strong progressive legislation that Biden really wants his legacy to be on the domestic sphere is endangered because of the way that the Israel-Palestine issue is fracturing the Democratic coalition, I think is spot on. I mean, it's true. Biden was kind of caught unawares by all of this, and so we are in slightly uncharted territory. I mean, it's true that American politics moves slowly and always lurches back in ways that people don't expect. But I mean, what we've seen in the past few weeks bespeaks both real anxiety among lots of Democrats around the shift in Israel that we've described, and also the growth and importance and impact of Arab Americans and Palestinian advocates in Washington. And so I think in this context, shifts could well be possible. I mean, it is true that Biden himself is somewhat changeable based on empathy when he's viewing situations. And I think that we've also seen that the media in the United States be more diverse in the way that it's covering it. So, I don't expect certainly dramatic shifts against aid in Israel soon, but there's definitely steam gathering on Washington to being much more mindful of what Israel's doing with the foreign aid and military aid that the United States has been providing it.
Ayan, does this mean, and again, I don't want to overstate the situation, you can correct me if I'm wrong, does this mean that in some ways, when it comes to any future peace process, if there will be one really that will formally re-begin, or restart, I should say, pardon me, that the U.S. will have a much more limited role than it has? Because, we've always been told that the U.S. is the one that is the mediator, that the U.S. is that neutral party that can bring these two sides together.
Well, I think the real problem with what you've just said is the imagination that there's going to be a peace process of any kind, if by that you mean negotiations between Arabs and Israelis over how to solve the problem. That really is not going to happen. What the United States and the rest of the world, the Western world, will move toward the kind of relationship or the kind of debate that occurred during the apartheid period in South Africa, when the struggle was over, should we as Western powers constructively engage with the South African regime to try to increase the prospects for democracy and equality in this whole country that's so divided? Or should we try to isolate South Africa and put pressure on it? That's the kind of diplomacy that it will gradually replace the old idea that once the fighting stops, we return to the negotiating table, which hasn't, of course, worked, and nobody thinks it can work anymore. 1 out of 11 Israeli Jews live in the West Bank, for example. That's just one sign of why that's impossible. The entire Israeli left that supported a two-state solution has been destroyed or eviscerated, disappeared. There really isn't a political basis, even on the Palestinian side, for anything like what Israel would be capable of offering. So that's off the table. And what's going to be interesting is how the United States plays the role that it definitely still has, which is the only country in the world that a significant number of Israeli Jews trust. And that gives the United States a power that no other country has in moving the situation forward toward a better future, or I would say more accurately, a better set of problems than it has today.
Khalil, I wonder what your thoughts are on the kind of leverage that the United States still has over the situation. I mean, certainly, of course, the weapon sales, military aid, all of that is huge leverage, but can it really use that? I mean, does it have the power? Does the president have that power solely to do that? Congress, even Senate? I mean, or are their hands, in a sense, tied in this case, and they then therefore almost have a weakened position?
Look, Waqar, the U.S. remains a superpower, maybe not a great power the way it sees itself, but it is still a superpower and does have a lot of influence on the different parties in the region, particularly on Israel, and as Ian said, on key constituencies here at home in the U.S. that enables it to do that. But there are some really serious and built-in problems with the U.S. role that is forced to change sooner or later by events. Frankly, if the dream that Mr. Biden entertains and is promising to do down the road of starting, maybe resuscitating some kind of an initiative in the region, it can't be on the same basis, on the same premises, on the same nature of role that he or the U.S. has played in the past. History doesn't go backwards. The situation has changed tremendously. The problem with the definition of U.S. role really is the fact that the U.S. has arrogated to itself over the years to be the sole peacemaker in the Middle East, and it has refused to share that role. That was visible last week at the UN. It refused to share that role with the UN, refused to allow any progress at the Security Council in this regard. And it became visible just the last 24 hours, including this morning, as we speak, this morning, Washington's time, with regard to France. The fact that France is engaging in a little initiative is enraging some people in the administration, and they have declared their opposition to that French-Arab, if you will, proposal for a ceasefire in the region. And some in Europe has accepted that diktat by Washington because they have other interests with Washington. So they have lowered their expectation and allowed the U.S. to continue to lord it over Middle East policy, even though that impacts on their interest as Europe in the region. And this political self-emasculation, if you will, by the Europeans has to also end at one point due to the changes that are taking place in Europe that David referred to earlier. So
Khalil, I do apologize, Khalil. I'm going to cut you off. I do sincerely apologize. We're quickly running out of time, so I just wanted to get your permission to give David one last word in before we let all three of you go. David, we have about just a minute left. Do you think that it is time, in fact, for the U.S. to possibly forego this role that it has almost self-appointed itself as the sole peacemaker in this regard? Maybe it is time to let others in, and maybe there will be more success in that regard?
Right. Well, I definitely agree with Khalil. I mean, I don't think that an impulse that the United States has to be the center or unique in its role makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've seen Biden moving in more multilateral ways, and I think that that's critical. None of us hold up a lot of hope for what can happen, when this awful round of fighting is done. But I think what hope there is around new multilateral reconfigurations. I mean, and, really trying to sort of hope that also the Israeli public can change the Israeli polity the way that we've seen the American polity changed in recent months. And I do think that, renewed playing around with the kind of multilateralism we see in the Arab world and elsewhere offers potential new overtures, if not, any kind of a glaring blueprint for success, as I am described.
Yeah. Very well. Was a final word, but we really appreciate David, Khalil, and Ayan for taking their time out early this morning, speaking to us respectively from Amherst, Washington, and Philadelphia, for sharing their expertise with us upon what's happening in the occupied territories and the Western, as I put it in my introduction, role, more specifically the U.S. role in all of this, be it military aid, be it political cover at the United Nations, be it its self-appointed role as peacemaker, or as we understand its self-appointed role as peacemaker. Maybe it is time for the U.S. to step back from this, let others take the mantle and do their best in trying to create a just resolution to this issue once and for all, for the sake of less bloodshed and less violence, and for less innocents being killed, less journalists, for example, being targeted, etc. I mean, the list is really endless. There is a shift happening. We've discussed that in this discussion as well, up even within the U.S. establishment and U.S. American Jews, for example, and that's very critical and that's very important as well, because that then adds ever more pressure then on the administration then to act in kind and to react in kind. And we'll, of course, be keeping a very close eye on all ceasefire efforts as well here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in a continuing coverage of what's been happening across the occupied territories, it's really important to also discuss the media, because the media always plays a very vital role at such times, as it always has when it comes to the issue of the occupation and of Palestine. We've seen, as in with past such incidences, that Israel has also attacked media organizations this time around, targeting specific buildings which hosted media organizations from around the world. world, international media organizations such as AP and otherwise. Now, it's not just buildings, for example, or studios or the infrastructure that is targeted by Israel often, but very, very often, in fact, it's journalists themselves who are in the firing line, either in cross-firing line and or are targeted very directly. So we even had, in fact, a CNN crew who not too long ago was manhandled on the streets in Israel proper, and they were pushed around by Israeli soldiers. So it's not like it's just those who are on the quote-unquote pro-Palestine side who are being targeted, but even those who may be trying to provide a coverage from the other side as well, who may have been in the wrong place, so to speak, at this point in time. Nevertheless, I mean, the narrative and or the goal seems to be to try to control the narrative, as I should say, and the story that comes out, but that seems to be a losing battle that Israel is waging at this time. Let's discuss that and all related issues further. We're now joined by Wafa Abdel-Rahman, who is founder and director of Palestiniyat, which is a media organization for youth and women. She's also the chief editor of Nawa, which is a feminist news agency. She's joining us today from Ramallah, but has family in Gaza itself. We're also joined by Akram and Sattari, who is an analyst and journalist, and he is based in Khan Younis in Gaza. Akram and Wafa, thank you both for taking your time out to speak to us today here in Scope. Wafa, I'd like to start with you. Again, on the angle of the importance of media during such times. I want to get your thoughts on that and any Israeli attempts to possibly try to control the narrative.
Actually, when anybody is questioning why the media is targeted, and this is not only the international media, you referred to AP, for instance, but actually the amount of media outlets that were targeted and bombed, we're talking about 29 media outlets and companies. 26 of them, they were leveled to the ground. 3 were badly damaged. Why the media? Because Israel wants to block the images that come from Gaza. They want to control, as you said, they want to control the narrative that comes out of the aggression on Gaza. And so the world can relax and simply be silent, and nobody will hold Israel accountable to those crimes, which could be war crimes as well. So silencing the media, controlling the narrative, scaring Palestinians, because there is very important thing here. They're targeting those who are broadcasting live. And at the same time, Israel is banning international journalists from entering Gaza as it controls the borders to Gaza. So if you don't have international media, if you don't have live broadcast from Gaza, nobody will know what is happening and what are the implications and the effect on people's lives. Yeah. And here comes our role as social media and other international media that doesn't have offices in Gaza, but is keen, like yours, is keen to listen to the Palestinian narrative and tell what the Palestinian narrative is.
Akram, as far as, the narrative goes, right, and I know you've been covering, especially from Gaza, the situation there for quite a number of years. What are your thoughts on this? Again, this is not a new tactic. This happened back in 2014. It's happened often over these years, even before that and after. If the goal is to control the narrative, certainly Israel is failing in that regard, isn't it?
In fact, it's not an attempt to control the narrative. It's rather an attempt to wipe out the narrative. They have been targeting what we call them and what we are proudly calling them the gods of the truth. The journalists, the media people, the media outlets, the different actors who are trying to reflect the truth about what is happening in Gaza have been targeted. 69 violations of the freedom of expression, 69 violations, very shocking incidents, very shocking footage coming out from Gaza showing the destruction, like was rightly said by our dear colleague Wafa, that the buildings were reduced to rubble. People who are actively engaging in the coverage of the situation in Gaza were targeted, their vehicles were targeted, were burnt, and the Israeli occupation still continues to do that. Even they were daring enough to target one US-based media outlet, and they were justifying that. They are trying to silence the people of Palestine. They are trying to show a totally different image from the truly image that is taking place in Palestine. And they have been failing miserably in bringing an end to the voice of truth that is coming out of Palestine. Because number one, we have the social media platforms that are serving as an alternative media. And number two, because we have the dedicated people in Palestine who are also, like was rightly said by Wafa, who are not scared by the fear tactics used by the Israeli occupation, and who vote to continue that coverage and continue that struggle and see themselves part of the struggle to expose the truth about the Israeli occupation.
All right, I'm going to add another to the conversation. We're now also joined by Taher Abou-Aoun, who is a journalist. He's also based in Gaza. He's joining us now. Taher, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today. Can you tell us, Taher, your experience as a journalist in Gaza and the targeting of media on the part of Israel?
Actually, there is nothing left for the terrorist and organized crime state except dropping an atomic bomb on the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that already Israel has dropped tons of explosives equivalent to atomic bomb on the Gaza Strip in less than 10 days. The occupation targeted civilians and civil and health, educational, media and government and residential buildings. However, the resistance and the legendary steadfastness of the Palestinian people will not stop. Actually, we're talking about hundreds of residential towers and buildings, and talking about dozens of media buildings were targeted this war, and we're talking about more than 230 victims were martyred this war. Whoever wants a calm, just peace and security in the region, he has first to work on ending the Israeli occupation and allow the Palestinian people to obtain their legitimate and just rights to self-determination, to return and to their to state with Jerusalem as its capital. Until then, this occupation needs to realize that it must stop its war crimes and other crimes of ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes against humanity. This aggression and siege on the Gaza field, we can say also the settlement field and in the West Bank, and prisoner abuse, and trying to Judaizing the city of Jerusalem, and crimes of racial discrimination against our people and inside the 48 areas. This must be stopped by the world, and it must be we can say that the appropriate response to the current Israeli escalation in the Gaza Strip and all the violations of human rights in the West Bank and in Jerusalem is working to build a Palestinian strategy based on internationalizing the conflict and restoring national unity.
And talking about internationalizing the conflict, if I may come in, Wafa, I wanted to in fact talk about that, because you mentioned as well that there are a number of international journalists who have not yet been given permission to enter Gaza, especially this time around. But one wonders about the role of international journalists versus local ones, right? Those who are actually based, be it in Gaza or Ramallah, where you are, or elsewhere within the occupied territories, and the difference in the way that the two of them report, like the two sides report, because many of the times we do see a vast difference in the terminology, for example, used, and just the connection that those people have to the stories that they're reporting on.
Thank you for asking and bringing this up. Actually, as I said, the Israeli are banning the international journalists from entering Gaza. So you don't have international reporting from international journalists from Gaza, but you have locals, Palestinians, who are working with internationals and broadcasting. But this is not the whole story. The story actually has to do with what the international media outlets are actually promoting and whether they abide by the international law and the international terminologies that are used in such situations of conflict like the one that we have. Take, for example, the Deutsche Welle. This is like one of the biggest broadcasting academic organizations, and the editorial policy that was publicly published, we cannot, even as guests to the Deutsche Welle, we cannot mention the word occupation. Occupation is recognized in international law. We cannot talk about genocide. We cannot talk about apartheid. Apartheid was recognized very recently in a Human Rights Watch report that was based on evidence. So the international media outlets, they actually themselves, they are complicit to the attack and to the aggression in Gaza. This makes it, again, for Palestinians to raise their voices and to try, as Akram was saying, to try and use the alternative media. This is on one hand. We try to rely on more friendly media. And unfortunately, the Arab media didn't play this role in the latest aggression on Gaza, unlike the 2014 attack, for instance, and aggression on Gaza. That was different. We count on media that decides to be balanced, but it tries to be balanced under the definition of what balance is. It's either you are on the side of the oppressor or you choose the side of the oppressed, and you choose accordingly your terminology and whether you want to abide to the international law and to the international treaties concerning the protection of journalists, the right of people to self-determination, etc., etc. Yes.
That's a very good point that Wafa there mentioned, and this talk about balanced coverage. If I may, for the moment, Akram, just take a devil's advocate point of view, I would think that the other side would say the reason that these organizations try to send journalists into Gaza is possibly because, and you can, of course, argue against this, that journalists in Gaza would have a very biased point of view. Are journalists in Gaza or across Palestine able to give balanced coverage of what is happening?
Well, as a matter of fact, if we look at and I am perceiving the journalists in Gaza as victims. When you are moving under fire, when your house is being targeted, when your colleagues are dying in front of your eyes, when you are not safe, and when you are living in a shelter in a UN school for a very long time, and when you are on the streets trying to provide the coverage and you are being hit by an occupation, how can you be diplomatic in choosing your words? We have a misconception, and I think they have been trying to promote this misconception. They are expecting from the professional media, staff to provide them with a very diplomatic words about the killing that has been going on. As a matter of fact, there is a massacre, not only when it comes to the journalists, but also when it comes to the general population in Gaza Strip, and you cannot find any appropriate word to describe what is happening unless you call it a massacre. And like Wafa rightly said, and of course you can hear now the successive bombardments that are taking place, and I'm in a press house that serves many Palestinian journalists, and the journalists even here are subjected to this ongoing bombardment that is scaring everyone. So yes, they are trying to stop you from saying whatever you are saying. And whatever you are saying, they call you a biased person because they don't want to listen. And I might recall the experience of Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu has been assigned the job of developing a fact-finding committee to study the situation in Gaza and to provide an account, evidence-based account, to the atrocities that were committed in Gaza. So he said clearly that whatever was happening in Gaza is mounting to a war crime. And they were not so happy with him, and they were questioning his intentions, were questioning his background, were questioning his faith as well, and they were saying that this is not balanced. So it all depends on how we define balance. Balance is not a good means when it helps you blindfold your eyes and say things that you don't believe. But the right balance is to say the truth and advocate the truth and to defend the right of the people who are victims through providing them with a first account and first coverage of their suffering. Otherwise, then anything different than that is part, as like was said by Wafa as well, is we would be a complicit. We would be helping the occupation and purifying the face, the ugly face of the crimes that are being committed in the place.
Taher, as you may well know, Taher, in international media and more in Western media, there's always talk about Hamas, right, and Hamas's role in what is currently happening. Now, I don't want to put you in an odd spot, but I wanted to ask you, as a journalist yourself, are you able to talk about Hamas freely, even sitting in Gaza?
Yes, my friend. Before going to talk about our ability to cover news about Hamas or any other political parties in the Gaza Strip, we have to admit that the international community has failed to force the occupation state to respect the rules of the international humanitarian law and the laws of media, and especially the laws that were admitted by the United Nations resolution. As a journalist from the Gaza Strip, I assure to you that we are working under a heavy pressure in order to cover the real story, in order to connect the people and give the people the real picture in the Gaza Strip. And we are actually, at the same time, we are working under pressure of being able to cover all the sides of this destruction, all the sides of this misery that the people in the Gaza Strip are living right now at the war because of the Israeli crimes. We are not focusing in what Hamas is doing, because what Hamas is doing right now is a response for the Israeli crime. And the rule, and the most important rule about the media now, I think that the popular opinion and the worldwide opinion must have an act in order to tell the truth and to stop the law of jungle. That's the reality, and that's what should be done by the worldwide media. The world must tell the truth, stop the law of jungle, hold the occupation leaders accountable, and impose sanctions. It's time to stop the double standards policy, especially by the big media agencies in the world, and try to stop discrimination between dealing with double standards between the Palestinian story and the Israeli story.
We're just quickly running out of time, so I'll give you the final word. We've got a minute and a half left. Wafa, the argument I would think on the Israeli side, and again, I'm just putting this out for argument's sake, is that they would say that, listen, whatever challenges journalists may have because of Israel would be a lot worse, or are a lot worse, if we're looking at Palestinian leadership or Palestinian politicians, etc. Is that a fair point? I mean, there's always that comparison made, right, that Israel is more democratic, or Israel gives more freedoms than any Palestinian politician or party does.
This is the propaganda. I wanted to comment on Hamas, and you're asking me about this. My organization is very critical to Hamas. Hamas did shut down the organization or attacked me or hurt me. So there is this stereotype of how do we view Hamas. I'm a feminist, I'm leftist, I'm not affiliated with Hamas, I'm not a fan of Hamas social agenda, let's put it this way, but I can work freely in Gaza. So it's not really what the Israelis have been promoting for so long. So if we want to talk about balance means two things when it comes to coverage. One, you have to place things into context. Why Hamas is doing that? Why the resistance in general is doing that? Why Palestinians are reacting to the Israeli aggression like that? So the context is very important. And second is addressing the roots of this conflict. This is not a single one-time conflict or aggression that happens suddenly, or rockets that are sent from Gaza to Israel. No. There are roots to this that started long beyond 1948 and what happened to the Palestinians. So if we place it here, within the context, within the roots, I think this is the meaning of balance. Balance, you don't take one incident, etc. For us, with the leadership question, this is my final thing, it's up to us. We Palestinians, we choose our leadership. I'm not happy with the current leadership in Ramallah, but it's not for the Americans or Europeans to decide this is a good or not good leadership. It's my work. It's my job to challenge them, to change them through elections, through democratic means. But it's a Palestinian internal thing that is up to us.
Indeed. We'll leave there at that, but we really, really appreciate Wafa, Taher, and Akram for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules, especially during these days that we're seeing the events play out across the occupied territories. Wafa is speaking to us there from Ramallah. Taher was speaking to us from Gaza, and Akram was also speaking to us from Gaza, from the Khan Younis area. We were discussing their media and how media has come under attack, as it has in past such incidences as well, by Israel, be it in Israeli quote-unquote territories themselves and or within the more Palestinian territories such as Gaza, Ramallah, etc. Also, this makes the job that much harder for journalists to be able to then provide proper balanced coverage for the rest of us on the outside. And yes, it's very important to have factual information come out and not biased information, but journalists can only really report what they see around them, and they should not be blocked from doing so. And this goes for, of course, every place around the world. Journalism is an extremely important aspect of all such conflicts, and they must not be targeted at any point in time by any government, especially that of an occupier as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.